The day they laughed at us, I promised myself I would remember every detail. Not the insult itself. Not the polite, measured tone of the High Arbiter's voice as she delivered the verdict. I promised myself I would remember the silence that came after. The silence from 47 civilizations sitting in a chamber the size of a city, watching one human man stand alone at the center podium, and feeling absolutely nothing about what they had just done to him. My name is Kale Duran. I was Earth's first diplomatic ambassador to the Galactic Concord. I was 39 years old. I had spent 11 years studying alien languages, political theory, and interstellar law, and I had just been told, in front of every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, that my species was not good enough to sit at the table. The grand spire of Velthara Prime was the most beautiful structure I had ever stood inside. It rose 40 stories above the surface of the planet, made from a crystalline material that caught the light of 3 suns and scattered it in colors that had no names in any human language. The chamber itself seated 12,000 delegates. Every seat was full the day I presented Earth's case. I had prepared for 2 years. I had rehearsed the speech in 17 languages. I had memorized the cultural customs of every major species in attendance so I would not accidentally offend anyone before they even heard my words. I arrived early. I stood straight. I spoke clearly. I told them about Earth. I told them about our history of pulling ourselves out of disaster after disaster. I told them about our science, our medicine, our art, our reach into the stars. I spoke for 11 hours without a break, because the Concord's rules allowed a first contact applicant to speak for as long as they needed. I used every minute. When I finished, the High Arbiter, Ixvithcal of the Soral Dominion, a creature with 7 long limbs and eyes that moved independently of each other, consulted briefly with her panel. The consultation lasted less than 4 minutes. Then she spoke. Earth is classified as a Class 4 nascent world. Its population is biologically unstable, psychologically volatile, and culturally fractured beyond acceptable parameters for Concord membership. The application is denied. Earth is granted observation status, pending reassessment in no fewer than 2 standard centuries. That was it. 11 hours of everything I had. 4 minutes of deliberation. 3 sentences. I stood at the podium for a moment longer than I should have. Not because I was going to argue. I had been briefed thoroughly enough to know that arguing would only confirm their assessment. I stood there because I needed one breath. Just one. To take everything I was feeling and put it somewhere it could not show on my face. Then I nodded, gathered my materials, and walked back to the human observation booth at the far edge of the chamber. The delegate from the Kethvar Collective, a heavily built creature with a face like layered stone, did not even watch me leave. Neither did most of the others. They had already moved on to the next item on the agenda. Only one being watched me walk the entire length of that chamber. His name was then. He was Velithari, a species that resembled, loosely, a tall human with pale blue skin and large, slightly luminous eyes. He was a junior diplomatic aide assigned to the Concord's welcoming committee, which in practice meant he was the one tasked with telling new applicants where the washrooms were and how to find their assigned seats. Then had been the first alien to speak to me when I arrived on Velthara Prime, 6 months earlier. He had also been the first to ask me a genuine question about Earth, not as part of a protocol but because he actually wanted to know. He had asked me what rain felt like. I had told him it depended on the rain. Sometimes it felt like the sky was trying to apologize for something. He had thought about that for a long time and then said, "That is a very complicated relationship with weather." I had liked him immediately. Now, as I reached the human booth and sat down, then appeared beside me within minutes. He sat quietly for a moment. The chamber was already buzzing with the next proceeding. "I know this is not the outcome you hoped for," he said. I kept my eyes on the chamber floor. It was not the outcome anyone on Earth hoped for. I had been their best chance, and I had failed. The High Arbiter's reasoning, then continued carefully, is based on documented historical patterns. Your species has been observed for 200 years by long-range monitoring probes. The data shows a consistent pattern of internal conflict, environmental self-damage, and rapid, unstable technological acceleration. The Concord has seen this pattern before. It rarely ends well. I looked at him. And when it does not end well, I said, "What does the Concord do?" He did not answer immediately. Which told me everything. "Observation status," he finally said. "Your sector of space will be monitored. If Earth reaches a point of self-termination, the Concorde will record it. If Earth stabilizes, the reassessment timeline will be moved forward. If we destroy ourselves, I said, they will write it down. Then's luminous eyes held something I could not quite name. It was not pity. It was something heavier than pity. I do not agree with all of the Concorde's policies, he said quietly. I want you to know that. I nodded. I believed him. Which was the only reason I did not say what I was actually thinking. That night, back in the small human delegation quarters, I sat at my comm terminal for a long time before I started writing my report to Earth Command. The words came slowly. I had to be honest. I had to tell them that every argument I made had been heard and dismissed. That the Concorde had already made up its mind before I walked in. That the verdict was not really about our science or our capability or even our history of conflict. It was about fear dressed in the language of reason. They looked at us and saw something unpredictable. Something they could not fully model or control. And so they put us in a box labeled too dangerous to include and moved on. I wrote all of that. Then I wrote the line that mattered most. I wrote, they do not understand what they have just done. I sent the report. Then I sat back and waited. The response came 3 hours later. It was short. Shorter than I expected. It read, understood. Maintain your post. Continue observation. Do not let them see you watching. I read it twice. Then I understood what it meant. They were not recalling me in defeat. They were not asking me to fight the decision through official channels. They were leaving me exactly where I was, inside the Concorde's own house, with open access to everything they discussed, every policy they passed, every decision they made about the galaxy. And they were telling me to watch. I looked around the small room. The walls hummed faintly with the life support systems of a station built by alien hands for alien comfort, adjusted just enough for a human to tolerate. Outside the narrow viewport, Veltara Prime turned slowly in the dark. Somewhere out there, 47 civilizations had just decided that humanity was not worth their time. I opened a new document and began taking notes. 18 months passed. They were not wasted months. The Concorde assigned Earth a sector they called the threshold margin. It was presented to me as a diplomatic gesture, a space of our own within the Concorde's broader framework. What it actually was, and what then quietly confirmed when I asked him directly, was a dead zone. No mineral wealth. No usable star systems. No trade traffic. No military significance whatsoever. They had handed us a corner of space that no one else wanted and called it a gift. The human station they permitted us to operate there was small. It held a crew of 12, including myself. It was equipped with standard communication arrays, basic life support, and observational instruments good enough to watch everything happening in the Concorde's inner systems, but not powerful enough to reach beyond Concorde space in any meaningful way. It was, in every practical sense, a very comfortable cage. I did not tell my crew to feel that way. They were professionals, each of them selected carefully, each of them carrying the same quiet understanding I carried. We were not here to feel sorry for ourselves. We were here to learn everything we possibly could about how this galaxy actually worked. And so we did. The Concorde was, I discovered, a far more complicated structure than it appeared from the outside. From a distance, it looked like 47 civilizations in peaceful cooperation. From the inside, it looked more like 47 families sharing one very large house, all of them politely furious with each other about something, none of them willing to say it out loud. The Soral Dominion controlled the bureaucratic infrastructure. They wrote the rules, they interpreted the rules, and they sat on every major committee. They were not corrupt in the traditional sense. They were simply very good at making sure that every decision, no matter how it was framed, happened to benefit Soral interests in some small way. Over centuries, all those small ways added up. The Kethvar Collective provided military deterrence. They were the Concorde's acknowledged security force, large, organized, disciplined, and deeply traditional. They did not want power in the political sense. They wanted order. They were very serious about order. What they considered order and what other species might call freedom were not always the same thing, but no one argued with them openly because the Kethvar fleet was the largest in the Concorde by a significant margin. The Ellarians were the oldest species in the Concorde and perhaps the strangest to understand. They were small, slow-moving, and spoke so quietly that most recording equipment struggled to capture them. But every other species in the Concord listened when they spoke. They had a reputation for being right about things, not in a strategic sense but in a moral one. When the Ellerians said a course of action was unwise, civilizations that ignored them tended to regret it. No one knew exactly why this was. It simply was. And then there were the dozens of smaller, younger species, the ones who had joined the Concord within the last few centuries. They filled the chamber seats and voted on resolutions and wrote passionate speeches, and in practice they held very little actual influence. The Concord's structure ensured that real decisions happened in committees dominated by the older powers, and by the time anything reached a full vote, the outcome had already been arranged. I documented all of this carefully and sent it home in encrypted reports. What I did not document, because I could not find the right words for it, was the feeling that built up in me over those 18 months. It was not anger. It was something colder and more focused. It was the feeling of watching a system that was very confident in its own wisdom, and very wrong about several things that mattered. The thing that made it concrete was the Dravosi. I first heard the name in month 4 of my posting. A small civilization, one system, one inhabited world, approximately 2 billion people. They had been members of the Concord for 60 years. They had no military of their own, having disbanded it voluntarily as part of their membership agreement. The Concord guaranteed protection of member worlds. They trusted that guarantee. Then the Vorith Empire, a non-member state operating at the outer edge of Concord space, began a campaign of systematic destruction against the Dravosi. Not for resources. Not for territory. The Vorith, from what the intelligence reports suggested, did it for ideological reasons. The Dravosi practiced a form of communal governance that the Vorith considered philosophically offensive. The Dravosi petitioned the Concord for intervention on the 14th day of the campaign. The Concord opened a formal committee to assess the situation. I sat in the observation section of the chamber every single day of that committee. I watched the debates. I listened to the speeches. I watched the procedural motions and the counter-motions and the requests for additional data and the delays for translation and the concerns about setting precedents and the arguments about whether this technically qualified as the kind of threat the protection clause was designed to address. The committee met for 68 days. On day 40, the Vorith destroyed the Dravosi capital. On day 68, the committee produced a resolution condemning the Vorith's actions and recommending economic sanctions. The resolution passed with strong majority support. The sanctions were applied. The Vorith ignored them. The Dravosi, by that point, had fewer than 300 million people left alive. I sat in my quarters that night and stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my comm and sent a personal message to them. I did not ask a diplomatic question. I asked the only question that felt real. Did anyone in that chamber actually care, I wrote, or were they all just performing the appearance of caring? His response came quickly. It was 3 words. Both, he wrote. And neither. I thought about that answer for a week. It was, I eventually decided, the most honest thing anyone in the Concord had said to me. A few weeks later, I had a brief private meeting with the High Arbiter Ixvithcal. These meetings happened occasionally, a courtesy extended to observation status representatives. She was always polite, always precise, and always faintly condescending in a way that felt entirely unconscious, as though she genuinely did not realize she was doing it. She asked how I was finding my posting. I told her it was instructive. She asked if I had any concerns I wished to raise. I told her I was still processing the Dravosi situation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, that the Concord operates on a framework built over 1,200 years. That framework has maintained relative peace across 47 civilizations for centuries. The loss of the Dravosi is a tragedy. But the frameworks that protect the whole cannot be dismantled to address every individual crisis. This is a difficult truth. It is, nonetheless, a truth. I looked at her and said, with great respect, who decides which crises are individual and which are worth the whole? She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, that is why we have committees. I thanked her for her time and left. That night I wrote the longest report I had ever sent home. I described the Dravosi. I described the committee. I described every face in the chamber on the day the resolution passed, the small relief in their body language that the process had concluded without requiring anything truly difficult of them. At the end of the report, I wrote one line that I encoded separately, in the private channel that only Earth Command could read. I wrote, they do not intervene. Not really. Not when it costs them something. The response from Earth Command was faster than usual. It came back in under an hour. It read, "Good. Keep watching. We have been running plans for 14 months. We are ready when the need is real." I read that line several times. I had not known about the 14 months. They had not told me, because if I had known I might have behaved differently in the chamber, might have let something show in my face during one of those interminable committee sessions. They had been building something back home. Quietly, carefully, without a single public announcement. I looked out the viewport at the dead sector they had assigned us. I thought, they have no idea what is coming. And then, immediately after, neither, honestly, do I. 2 years after I first stood in the Grand Spire, the Krethsol arrived. I say arrived because that is the word that appears in every official Concord record of the event, but arrived does not capture what they actually did. Arrived suggests a kind of intent. A direction. The Krethsol did not arrive in the way a ship arrives at a destination. They came the way a storm front comes, wide and fast and without any visible interest in what was already there. They were not members of the Concord. They were not known to the Concord, which itself was alarming, because the Concord had spent centuries cataloging every spacefaring civilization within a very wide radius. The Krethsol had apparently spent that entire time doing something else entirely. The first contact was with a Concord monitoring station near the outer boundary. The station sent a standard greeting protocol. The Krethsol responded by dismantling the station. Not with weapons, exactly. More like they simply took it apart. The first inhabited world they reached was a place called Deathsoren, home to a small Concord member species called the Senvari. The Krethsol did not occupy it, did not demand surrender, did not make any communication at all. They simply began. Within 18 hours, Deathsoren was no longer an inhabited world. The Concord convened an emergency full session within 2 days. That was fast by their standards. I attended as an observer, sitting in the gallery above the main floor, watching 12,000 delegates process what they were looking at. The debate was not like the Dravosi debate. This time, there was genuine fear in the room. I could see it in the way bodies moved, the way voices dropped in pitch, the way the normally composed Soral ministers kept glancing at the data feeds from the outer boundary. They had not felt this kind of fear in a very long time. They had forgotten what it looked like on themselves. A Concord response fleet was authorized within 3 days. That was also fast. The fleet was substantial, drawing from the Kethvar, the Soral, and 6 other member civilizations with significant naval capacity. By any reasonable measure, it was one of the most powerful military forces the Concord had assembled in 2 centuries. It reached the Krethsol's second target system on day 7. On day 9, the Concord fleet was gone. Not defeated in the traditional sense. Not pushed back or forced to retreat. Gone. Debris across 300,000 kilometers of space. The few ships that survived reported back before their systems failed. What they described did not translate easily. The Krethsol did not fight the way anyone in the Concord had ever seen anything fight. They did not use formation tactics or coordinated firing patterns. They seemed to operate as something close to a unified mass, individual ships adjusting independently at speeds that Concord tactical modeling could not predict. Attacking them was like trying to strike water. The shape was always somewhere else by the time you hit. 2 more worlds fell before the Concord could even organize a second fleet. I watched the emergency sessions from my gallery seat, day after day. The fear in the room had changed texture. It was not the kind of fear that sharpens people into action. It was the kind that softens people, that makes them look for reasons why the problem might solve itself, why perhaps this could still be handled through diplomacy, why sending another fleet before fully understanding the failure of the first would be premature. On the 4th day after the fleet's destruction, a private communication opened on my terminal. It was coded on a frequency that only my station used. It was from Earth Command. It was 7 words. We have been watching for 8 months. Ready. I sat with those 7 words for a long time. I had no authority to authorize a military action. I had no diplomatic standing to grant access to Concord space. I was an observation status representative of a species that had been told, to its face, that it was too volatile and too dangerous to be trusted with membership. If I responded to that message and Earth acted on it, I would be violating a dozen Concord protocols. I would potentially give the Concorde grounds to expel humanity from observation status entirely and classify us as a threat. I thought about the Dravosi. I thought about what 68 days of committee work had produced. Then I typed back, "No authorization exists. I cannot stop you." I sent it. Then I closed the channel and walked down to the main chamber floor and found them near the delegate entrance. "Something is going to happen," I told him quietly. "In the next few days. I need you to trust me and not ask questions right now." Then looked at me for a long moment. His luminous eyes searched my face. "What kind of something?" he asked. "The kind," I said, "that changes things." He was quiet. Then he said, "Should I be frightened?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Not of what's coming to fight the Krethsul," I said. "But afterward, everyone in that chamber is going to have to rethink a few assumptions they have been carrying for a very long time. That part might be uncomfortable." He nodded slowly. The next morning, 40 human warships crossed into Concorde space without any communication, any request for permission, or any prior announcement. They were not diplomatic vessels. They were not the small, deliberately limited craft that Earth had previously been permitted to operate. They were long, dark, angular ships built on principles the Concorde's analysts had never seen, and they moved with a kind of quiet confidence that then later described to me as making him feel, irrationally, like the room temperature had dropped. The Concorde's reaction was immediate and loud. The emergency session that morning was the most chaotic I had ever observed. Delegates shouted across the floor in 6 languages. The Kethvar military minister demanded an explanation. The Soral High Arbiter Ixvithkal called for human representation to appear before the full chamber immediately and explain the incursion. I arrived at the podium and let the room settle. Ixvithkal looked down at me from the High Arbiter's position. Her 7 limbs were very still. "Ambassador Duran," she said, "your species has sent a military force into Concorde space without authorization. You will explain this immediately." I looked up at her. Then I looked around the room. 12,000 delegates. Every eye, every visual organ, every sensory apparatus pointed at me. I said, "Watch." Then I stepped back from the podium and sat down. The chamber erupted again. But then, over the noise, the primary display feeds that lined the chamber walls, the ones showing live sensor data from the outer boundary, flickered. Then they updated. The human fleet had reached the Krethsul. I have been asked, many times since that day, what it looked like. People want the details. They want to understand what 40 human warships did that the combined military power of 12 Concorde civilizations could not. What I saw, watching from the chamber gallery beside them and a row of very silent Concorde ministers, was not what I expected. I had expected something powerful, something that would make the chamber gasp. What I actually witnessed was something more difficult to describe, because the most striking thing about it was not the scale. It was the shape. The Concorde fleet, in the recordings of its destruction, had looked like a military force. Formations of ships, coordinated firing patterns, command structures giving and receiving orders. Everything organized, everything centralized, everything moving according to plan until the plan stopped working and then everything stopping together. The human fleet looked nothing like that. From the moment contact was established, no 2 human ships seemed to be doing the same thing. They split apart immediately, not in panic but in a pattern that the Concorde's tactical analysts, who were watching live alongside everyone else, could not categorize. 3 ships went wide left. 7 went deep into the formation below. 12 split into 2 groups and came at the Krethsul mass from angles that should have put them directly in each other's firing paths, except they were not in each other's paths at all. Somehow they were not. Ixvithkal was standing beside me in the gallery by this point. She had left the High Arbiter's seat and come up to watch. I noticed, without looking directly at her, that her limbs had gone very still. "They are not following a command pattern," one of the Concorde analysts said from somewhere behind me. His voice had that particular quality of a person trying to stay professional while something in their understanding was shifting. "Each unit is operating independently. But they are not acting independently. How are they coordinating?" "They have trained together for a long time," I said. "But without a central command, how do they know what the others will do?" I thought about how to explain it and found that I could not do it quickly. So I just said, "They know each other." The analyst did not respond to that. I do not think he knew what to do with it. The Krethsul, to their credit, adapted faster than the Concorde fleet had. The mass began to shift, individual units breaking away to pursue the human ships that had gone wide, others converging on the cluster that had gone deep. They were fast, and they were responsive, and for the first 11 minutes of the engagement, nothing decisive happened. Ships moved. Energy was exchanged. The Krethsol adjusted each time a human unit threatened to establish an advantage. But here is what the Concord analysts did not see immediately, because they were watching individual engagements. Here is what I started to notice around minute 12, and what made the air in my chest go strange. The human ships that were not in direct contact with the Krethsol were not waiting. They were learning. Every ship that was not currently engaged was watching, adjusting its position, reading what the engaged ships were finding out. And the engaged ships were not trying to win their individual fights. They were finding out things. They were testing. And when a ship found something out, something about how a Krethsol unit responded to a particular angle of approach, the surrounding human ships immediately began incorporating that into their movements, without any communication that the analysts could detect. It was not a hive mind. I want to be precise about this because it matters. It was not coordination through signal or command or any external connection at all. It was something that happens when people who have trained together for years face a new problem together. They do not need to communicate every thought because they already share a framework. They already know how each other thinks. They have already run 10,000 versions of a moment like this together in practice, and so when the moment is real, they do not need to explain. They just move. The Krethsol had never seen this before. Nobody in this part of the galaxy had ever seen this before. At minute 19, the shape of the engagement changed. The human ships that had gone deep emerged in 3 coordinated groups at vectors that the Krethsol mass had not protected, because protecting those vectors while responding to the other threats would have required the Krethsol to split in ways their own coordination could not manage. The deep ships were not the most powerful in the human fleet. But they were precise, and they were exactly where the Krethsol had no answer for them. Then made a small sound beside me. I looked at him. His face was doing something I had not seen before. It was not fear, exactly. It was the look of someone who has believed a certain thing their whole life and is watching that belief quietly leave the room. They are not fighting to stop them, he said softly. They are disassembling them. That is the only word that fits. It was not a battle in the sense I had grown up understanding battles. It was methodical. Each gap in the Krethsol's response that the human ships revealed was immediately and specifically exploited by the unit best positioned to exploit it. There was no triumphalism in any of it. There was no visible anger or urgency. The human fleet moved through the engagement the way a careful person takes apart a complicated mechanism, turning each piece until it releases, setting it aside, moving to the next. By minute 31, the Krethsol mass had lost coherence. Individual units were no longer responding in patterns their own side could predict. Some were withdrawing. Some were doing nothing at all. Ixvithcal spoke. I had nearly forgotten she was standing beside me. She said, very quietly, "How long have they been capable of this?" I said, "I do not know exactly. We never needed to find out before." She turned to look at me. I kept my eyes on the feeds. "You never needed to," she said. "You mean there was never a sufficient threat?" I said, "I mean there was never something that got through to the people we care about." At minute 44, the 4 warships the Krethsol had tasked with their own communications were located and neutralized by a single human vessel that had spent the entire engagement appearing to do very little. That vessel had been, as far as I could tell from the feeds, simply watching everything, building a picture, waiting for the exact moment when eliminating those 4 ships would isolate the Krethsol command completely. That moment came at minute 44, and the vessel acted, and the Krethsol sent one final signal back toward their home space before the signal died. Nobody had to tell the rest of the Krethsol what to do after that. They did not have orders anymore. They had been a mass that worked through collective coordination, and the coordination was gone, and what remained were individual units that could not find their shape. The engagement ended formally at the 1 hour and 7 minute mark. The Concord chamber was completely silent. I mean that in the literal sense. 12,000 beings, not one sound. Not a shift in a seat or a quiet murmur or the rustle of a translation device adjusting. Nothing. I looked around at the faces, the forms, the bodies of 47 civilizations. I saw things in those faces that I had not seen before during my time in that chamber. Not the polite condescension of the first day. Not the procedural worry of the Dravosi debates. Not even the genuine fear of the past few weeks. I saw something much more fundamental than any of those things. I saw the moment when a certainty ends. Ixvithcal stood beside me for another long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was very controlled. "Ambassador Duran," she said. "Your ships will hold position and await Concord coordination instructions." I said, "Of course." She paused. Then she said, almost to herself, 1 hour. I did not respond. She walked back toward the High Arbiter's seat, and I watched her go, and then appeared at my shoulder and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "Kale. Your people scare me." I said, "I know." I did not say I am sorry, because I was not sure whether I was. I was proud and I was shaken and I was feeling something that I would need several days to fully name. It was the feeling of loving something enormous and complicated and realizing, all at once, just how enormous and complicated it actually was. 3 days later, Earth Command sent a single line. It read, "We are ready to come home, or we are ready to stay. Your call." I wrote back, "Stay. We are not done here." The Concorde did not thank us. I want to be honest about that because it matters. In the stories people tell about this period now, there is sometimes a version where the Concorde recognized what humanity had done and responded with immediate gratitude. That is not what happened. What happened is that Ixvithcal called an emergency full session of the Galactic Concorde 3 weeks after the engagement, and the first item on the agenda was not a resolution of thanks or an acknowledgement of what the human fleet had accomplished. The first item on the agenda was the question of Earth. I received notification of the session the previous evening. Then brought it to me in person, which was itself unusual. He came to the human station, which he had visited before but not often, and he sat across from me at the small table in my quarters, and he told me what the agenda said. I poured 2 cups of water. Human water. Then had told me once that he liked the weight of it, the way it had no color but still seemed to hold something in it. I poured 2 cups and slid one to him. He said, "Some on the council want to classify Earth as a Tier 1 strategic concern." I said, "What does that mean in practice?" "It means monitored containment. Your ships escorted out of Concorde space. Your station reduced to minimal staffing. Movement restrictions on human vessels throughout Concorde territory. And a formal reassessment, not in 2 centuries, but in 5. I thought about that. Then I said, "What does the other side want?" Then picked up the cup. Looked into it. "Immediate full membership," he said. The argument is that the safest way to manage an unpredictable power is to include it in the structure, not exclude it. Give it a seat, give it responsibilities, give it something to lose. The Concorde's history supports this. Civilizations inside the structure have not engaged in large-scale aggression against each other in over 800 years. And what does the High Arbiter want? I asked. Then was quiet for a moment. Ixvithcal has not spoken publicly, he said. But she asked to meet with you privately before the session. That meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I looked at the viewport. The 3 suns of Veltara Prime were setting in sequence, which produced an effect that I had never managed to get used to, the way the light changed color 3 times in one evening, moving through shades of orange and then green and then a deep blue that was almost purple. Then, I said, "You have been honest with me since the first day. I want you to be honest with me now. If you were voting, which way would it go?" He thought for a long time. Then he said, "I would vote for membership. Not because I am not frightened. I am frightened. What I watched 3 weeks ago, I will not pretend that was not frightening. But I think the Concorde made a mistake 2 years ago. I think we looked at something we did not understand and we called it inferior because inferior is easier to dismiss than complicated. And the things we dismiss have a way of growing anyway, just without us." I said, "That is a very honest answer." He said, "You asked for honesty." I said, "I did. Thank you." He finished his water and set the cup down and looked at me with those luminous eyes. "How do you feel, Kale?" he asked. "Right now, honestly, how do you feel?" I thought about it. "I feel," I said, "like someone who just watched his family do something extraordinary and frightening at the same time. I am proud. And I am aware, in a way I was not 2 years ago, of what we are capable of when we have to be. And I do not know exactly what to do with both of those feelings living in the same place." Then nodded slowly. He said, That sounds, actually, like a very human answer. The meeting with HFY the following morning was in a small room off the main chamber, one I had not been in before. It was simply furnished, which surprised me. I had expected everything in the High Arbiter's orbit to be elaborate. The room had 2 chairs, a low table, and a window that looked out over the Spire Gardens, where something that resembled grass but was a deep, brilliant red moved slowly in the artificial wind. She was already there when I arrived. She gestured to the second chair and I sat. For a moment she said nothing. She looked at the garden. Then she looked at me. "What does Earth want, Ambassador Duran?" she said. "Not strategically. Not politically. What do your people actually want from the Concord?" It was the most direct question she had ever asked me. I had prepared for many versions of this meeting on the walkover. I had prepared precise diplomatic answers and carefully worded positions. I put all of them aside. I said, "We want to not be left outside again." She was still. "That is all." She said. I said, "That is the center of it. Everything else is details." She turned back to the garden. A long silence passed. Then she said, "I made a judgment 2 years ago based on documented evidence and 400 years of Concord precedent for how young civilizations develop. I stand behind the methodology. I do not stand behind the conclusion it produced in your case." I said nothing. She said, "The evidence suggested instability." What the evidence did not measure, and what I did not look for because I had no framework that would have told me to look for it, was what that instability looked like under external pressure. Most unstable civilizations, when threatened beyond their capacity, fragment. The internal fractures become external ones. They do not find coherence. They lose it. She paused. "Your people did not lose it," she said. I said, "No." "Why?" she asked. She was not asking rhetorically. She genuinely wanted to understand. I thought about how to explain something I had spent a lifetime inside of and never had to translate before. I said, "Because the things that make us fractured in peace are the same things that make us unified in crisis. We argue about everything when nothing is threatening us. We cannot agree on small things. We have been arguing with each other for our entire recorded history about almost every question worth arguing about. But when something comes for the people we love, all of that goes somewhere else. Not away. Somewhere else. And what is left is just the part that moves together." HFY looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I see." I believed her. The session that afternoon was the largest gathering I had attended since my very first day in the Grand Spire. Every seat was full again. The feeds from Earth's outer transmission points were being monitored live. Somewhere back home, I knew, people were watching this. Not knowing exactly what was going to be said but knowing that it mattered. I was called to the podium for the second time in my career as Earth's ambassador. The room was quieter than 2 years ago. The quality of attention was different. 2 years ago I had been something to be assessed and categorized. Now I was something to be reckoned with, and the room knew it, and the difference was in every silent face turned toward me. I did not speak for 11 hours this time. I spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. I told them about the Dravosi. I told them about the 68 days. I told them that I sat in that gallery every single day and I watched, and I did not ask for an explanation because I already understood. I told them that the Concord had built something extraordinary over 800 years and I meant that sincerely, and that the extraordinary thing had a blind spot that it had the chance to address. I said, "You called us volatile. You were not entirely wrong. You called us fractured. You were not entirely wrong about that either. But you concluded from those things that we were lesser, and that conclusion was wrong. Not because we are not those things, but because those things are not the whole of us." I looked around the room. I said, "You watched 3 weeks ago. You saw what happens when humanity faces a threat to the people it loves. That is real. That is us. But I want you to understand that what you saw was not the exception. It was not a special circumstance we summoned from some hidden reserve. It is simply what we are, all the time, in every form. Curious and stubborn and furious and creative and absolutely unwilling to accept that any situation is beyond the ability of a determined person to change. We have been that way since before we could reach the stars. We will be that way long after this conversation is forgotten." I paused. "The Dravosi," I said, did not have anyone like that fighting for them when they needed it. I am standing in front of you today to tell you that we are here. We are not asking for a favor. We are asking for the same seat at the table that every other civilization in this room was given when they were ready. We are ready. The evidence of that was presented 3 weeks ago in a way that I think none of you will forget for a very long time. I stepped back from the podium. The chamber was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then the vote was called. It was not unanimous. I want to say that clearly because the people back home who watch the feed sometimes remember it as unanimous, and it was not. 14 delegations voted against. 9 abstained. The remaining 24 voted in favor. It was enough. The High Arbiter announced the result in the same controlled, precise voice she used for everything. Earth is elevated from observation status to full Concord membership, effective immediately, pending the completion of standard integration protocols. A formal representative seat on the main council floor will be assigned within 30 standard days. The chamber did not erupt in celebration. There was a murmur, a shift, a slow exhale that moved through 12,000 beings at different frequencies. I stood at the back of the chamber and let myself breathe. Then appeared beside me so quietly that I did not hear him approach. He did not say anything for a while. We stood together and watched the delegates begin to move and speak and disperse in the gradual way of a very large gathering that has just reached a conclusion. Then he said, quietly, "Kale. Your people scare me." I said, "I know." He said, "Please don't ever stop." I looked at him. He was watching the chamber floor with those luminous eyes, and there was something in his expression that I recognized because I had been carrying it myself for weeks. The complicated pride of watching something larger than yourself do something irreversible, and not being entirely sure how to feel about the size of it. That night I sat at my terminal for a long time before I began writing the report. When I finally started, I did not begin with the vote tally or the membership terms or the procedural details. I began with something I needed to say first, for myself and for whoever read it. I wrote, "They are afraid of us now." I did not want that. I wanted them to see us as equals. I wanted the kind of respect that comes from understanding, not from demonstration. I did not get the first kind today. I am not certain, after 2 years of watching how this place works, that the first kind was ever actually available to us. But the second kind is real. And it is ours. Do not waste it. I sent the report. Then I closed the terminal and sat in the quiet of the station and listened to the hum of life support and thought about Earth, spinning somewhere distant, full of arguing, complicated, stubborn, extraordinary people who had no idea that the galaxy had just looked at them and felt, for the first time, something close to awe. I thought, we earned our seat the hard way. I thought, maybe the hard way is the only way it ever means anything. Outside the viewport, Veltara Prime turned through its 3-sun evening, and the light changed color, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not strategy or discipline or patience. I let myself feel proud. Not because we had frightened them. Not because the vote had passed. But because 40 years from now, or 400, when some other species stood at a podium in the chamber and made their case to belong, the record would show that once, a species no one believed in had stood in that same spot and refused to be anything less than exactly what it was. And that was enough. That was more than enough.